For 15 years, Clara Thompson moved through the halls of Pinnacle Enterprises like a shadow, unseen and unnoticed. Every morning, she arrived with her mop and bucket, dressed in her worn navy blue uniform, blending into the background of the towering Chicago skyscraper. She cleaned the floors, emptied the trash, and wiped down the desks in offices where executives made million-dollar decisions, yet no one ever looked at her, not really. They rushed past in tailored suits, their polished shoes clicking against the marble, too absorbed in their own importance to acknowledge the woman who kept their spaces pristine. At first, Clara didn't mind. She had learned long ago that people like her, janitors, assistants, the ones who worked in the background, were invisible to the powerful. It was easier that way. She could observe without being questioned, listen without anyone suspecting. But over time, the weight of being unseen began to press on her. She knew every inch of that building, every locked office and whispered conversation. She had watched good people lose their jobs without a second thought, had seen executives laugh as they slashed salaries while increasing their own bonuses. And through it all, Clara kept her head down, hands steady on the mop, her silence a mask that hid the truth. Because Clara wasn't just a janitor. She had a secret, one that, if revealed, would shake Pinnacle Enterprises to its core. But she wasn't ready yet. Not until they gave her a reason. So, she continued scrubbing their floors, listening to their arrogance, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. And when that moment came, they would finally see her, not as the cleaning lady, but as the woman who held their fate in her hands. The moment that changed everything came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Clara was in the lobby, pushing her mop across the marble floor, lost in the familiar rhythm of her work. She had cleaned this building for 15 years, seen more than she ever let on, but she had never expected to become the center of attention. Victor Lang, the CEO of Pinnacle Enterprises, strutted into the lobby with his usual arrogance, surrounded by his entourage of executives. Their laughter echoed through the space, a sound Clara had grown used to. Then, it happened. Someone had spilled coffee near the elevator, probably one of them, but instead of acknowledging their own mess, Victor turned to Clara, smirked, and barked, "Clean it up, Grandma." For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The entire staff turned to watch, waiting for her reaction. The heat rose to Clara's face, not from embarrassment, but from the sting of deep, simmering anger. She could hear the snickers of the others, see the amusement dancing in their eyes as if she were nothing more than an object for their entertainment. But she swallowed her pride, gripping the mop tighter. She had learned long ago that people like Victor saw janitors as less than human, just tools to make their lives easier. That night, alone with her cleaning cart, she made a silent promise. He would regret this. Because what Victor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Clara Thompson wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Enterprises. And the man who had just mocked her would soon learn the price of his arrogance. For 15 years, Clara Thompson had lived in the shadows of Pinnacle Enterprises. Every morning, she arrived in her navy blue uniform, pushing her cart through the grand hallways of the Chicago high-rise, her presence unnoticed, her voice unheard. She moved like a ghost among them, an invisible figure wiping desks, emptying trash bins, and scrubbing floors while the executives strode past in polished shoes, talking about profits and expansion as if the world belonged to them alone. To them, she was nothing. Just the cleaning lady. But what they didn't know, what none of them had ever suspected, was that Clara was more than the woman who cleaned up their messes. She was, in fact, the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Enterprises. She had held the power to change everything for years, and yet, she had chosen to wait. 15 years earlier, Clara's beloved uncle, a wise and cautious investor, had left her a significant number of shares in the company. At first, the idea of stepping into the world of corporate leadership had overwhelmed her. So she made a choice, a quiet, deliberate decision to stay where she was, blending into the background while she observed everything. At night, as she wiped down desks in the empty offices, she listened to the murmurs of anxious employees fearing layoffs. She saw the discarded paperwork revealing shady deals and unethical budget cuts. And she paid close attention to Victor Lang, the CEO, who ruled with arrogance and greed, making decisions that destroyed lives without a second thought. She had watched him cut staff just to inflate the company's bottom line, laugh as he fired people in meetings, and joke about how disposable workers were. Still, she remained silent. Watching. Waiting. Then came the moment that shattered her patience. It had been a regular morning, like any other, when Victor Lang and his entourage stepped into the lobby, their laughter bouncing off the marble walls. A puddle of spilled coffee glistened near the elevator, likely from one of them, but instead of stepping around it, Victor turned to Clara with a smirk. "Clean it up, Grandma." His voice was sharp, dismissive, cutting through the room like a blade. The executives around him chuckled, their expensive suits and smug expressions a testament to their indifference. Clara stood there, gripping her mop tightly as the heat of humiliation burned through her. She could feel the weight of a dozen eyes on her, watching, waiting for her to react. For years, she had endured their condescending glances, their careless remarks. She had swallowed her anger, forced herself to keep her head down. But at that moment, something inside her snapped. That night, as she moved through the empty office, her usual routine felt different. The mop in her hand was no longer just a tool, it was a symbol of every moment she had been underestimated, dismissed, belittled. Victor Lang had no idea who he was mocking. She made a decision. It was time. Pulling out her phone, she scrolled through the photos she had taken over the years, shredded financial documents she had pieced together, emails she had fished from the trash, snapshots of fraudulent reports. Clara had been collecting evidence for years, and now, she had everything she needed. She called Tom, her old friend and trusted lawyer. "Tom," she said, her voice steady. "It's time." The next morning, she walked into Pinnacle Enterprises just as she always had, her uniform crisp, her bucket rattling against the floor. But this time, she wasn't just a janitor. She was the woman who would bring the empire down. After that humiliating moment in the lobby, Clara knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. The anger that had burned inside her turned into cold determination. She had spent 15 years being ignored, treated like she was nothing. But now, she was going to use their arrogance against them. She had seen too much over the years, financial reports mysteriously disappearing, emails about illegal budget cuts, employees fired without cause, and Victor Lang's blatant disregard for the people who worked beneath him. Clara had always been watching, but now, she would make sure she had proof. Every night, after the executives had left for the day, she moved through the office with purpose. Her mop and bucket were still her disguise, but her real work had begun. She dug through shredded papers, carefully piecing them back together. She slipped into copy rooms, printing out documents she had found in the trash. She snapped photos with her phone, files left on desks, emails carelessly discarded. The more she found, the angrier she became. There were records of unethical layoffs, financial statements that didn't add up, even emails where Victor openly mocked the very employees who had dedicated their lives to the company. Her hands sometimes trembled as she held the camera, but she forced herself to stay calm. Every piece of evidence brought her one step closer to justice. She met Tom in a small diner late one night, a thick folder clutched in her hands. Sliding it across the table, she watched as he flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing. "This is more than enough," he murmured. Then he looked up at her, a sharp glint in his gaze. "Clara, you have the power to end this." She exhaled slowly, gripping her coffee cup. "I know," she said. "And I will." Clara Thompson had never imagined this day would come. For 15 long years, she had been nothing more than an invisible figure, silently mopping the floors of Pinnacle Enterprises. Every morning, her mop bucket in hand, her uniform pressed, she was just a background character in the lives of the executives, ignored by everyone in the gleaming high-rise. She had become so accustomed to being overlooked that she'd almost started to believe it herself. But today would be different. Today, everything would change. As she walked through the building's sleek corridors, she couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, the sound of her mop bucket rattling as she moved through the halls was oddly calming. The office floors were empty now, save for the few souls who stayed late. Clara always found herself alone in these moments, scrubbing away the remnants of a busy day. But her mind was no longer occupied by the mundane tasks of cleaning. Today, her mind was sharp, focused, and determined. She had watched, year after year, as Victor Lang, the CEO, had expanded his empire, pushing out good people while lining his pockets with ill-gotten gains. He had made countless workers' lives miserable, all while smiling behind his desk, sipping his coffee, and patting himself on the back for his successes. Clara had been a quiet observer, silently watching his rise and taking notes in her mind. But when he humiliated her that fateful day in the lobby, the last of her restraint snapped. His cruel, mocking words had crossed a line she could no longer tolerate. That night, she made a promise to herself: Victor Lang would pay for what he had done. For weeks, she had gathered the pieces of evidence that would bring him down. It wasn't much, just small, seemingly insignificant details, at first. The misplaced papers, the conversations she overheard, the odd financial discrepancies she had noticed when she cleaned his office. But Clara wasn't just the cleaning lady, she was an observer. She had been watching him for years. Every night, she cleaned around his desk, noticing the shredded documents, the strange transactions hidden in plain sight. She started snapping pictures with her phone, quietly slipping them into her cart, all the while keeping her eyes open for more. The evidence was mounting. One night, she found herself sitting at a diner across town with Tom, an old friend and lawyer. She couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear as she shared her findings. Tom's eyes gleamed with recognition as he understood the gravity of the situation. "Clara," he said, leaning in closer, "you hold the cards. You're the majority shareholder. You can end this." The words hit her like a freight train. She had always known about the shares her late uncle had left her, shares in Pinnacle Enterprises that were now worth millions. But she had never cared about the money. She had cared about the people, her fellow workers, the ones Victor had discarded without a second thought. Now, those shares were her weapon, and with Tom's help, she was about to use them. The next few days were a blur of late nights and anxious anticipation. Clara kept her head down, mopping floors as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. She was gathering more evidence, printing documents late into the night, preparing for the upcoming shareholders' meeting. She had seen Victor strut through the halls, his confidence blinding him to the storm that was brewing just beneath his feet. He had no idea what was coming. Clara smiled to herself. It was time. The morning of the shareholders' meeting arrived. Clara felt the weight of it in her bones, the culmination of years of humiliation, the countless nights spent mopping floors, the quiet anger she had harbored all these years. She stood in the lobby, staring up at the glass walls of the building that had always seemed so untouchable, so far out of reach. Today, it would be different. She would make sure of it. She entered the boardroom with her mop bucket, just as she always did. Her uniform, a symbol of the years she had spent as the invisible cleaning lady, was the same. But her resolve was stronger than it had ever been. She could feel the eyes of the executives on her as she walked in, their expressions confused, maybe even amused. Victor Lang, seated at the head of the table, looked up, his expression turning to one of disdain. "What's this?" "The janitor's here to clean up the boardroom too," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Clara stood tall, not an ounce of hesitation in her step. Her heart raced, but she remained calm, her voice unwavering. "I'm not just the cleaning lady, Victor," she said, stepping forward, her hands gripping the folder that held the future of the company. "I own this company." The room fell silent. Victor's smug smile faltered for just a moment before he burst into a laugh, dismissing her words as a joke. "Nice try, sweetheart. Get back to your mop." The board members chuckled nervously, unsure whether to take Clara seriously or not. But Clara didn't back down. She opened the folder, pulling out page after page of evidence. Financial discrepancies, illegal layoffs, falsified reports, documents that Victor had thought were safely hidden from view. She read the evidence aloud, her voice strong and steady as she laid it all bare. This, Clara said, tapping the paper for emphasis, is your downfall, Victor. I have the shares, and I have the votes. Tom stepped forward, his presence solid behind her. Everything she's saying is true. Clara Thompson is the majority shareholder. Victor Lang is no longer in control of Pinnacle Enterprises. Victor's face turned pale. His eyes darted around the room, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a way out. But it was too late. His grip on the company was slipping fast. You're fired, Victor. Effective immediately, Clara said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The room exploded into whispers, the board members unsure of what to do next. But Victor had no words left. He stood, red-faced and furious, his fists clenched at his sides. His empire had crumbled before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Clara watched him leave the room, his footsteps echoing through the hallway like the death knell of his reign. She turned to the board. Things changed today, she said firmly. No more layoffs for profit. No more treating people like disposable commodities. From now on, we do things right. As the board members slowly began to nod in agreement, Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the message. It's done. The world knows. Victor's world had come crashing down. By that evening, the news was everywhere. The headlines screamed about his ousting, about the fall of a man who had once thought he was untouchable. His assets were seized, his accounts frozen, and the people he had wronged were finally speaking out. His reputation was shattered beyond repair. Clara smiled as she sat back in her apartment that night. The weight of 15 years of humiliation had finally been lifted from her shoulders. But it wasn't just her victory, it was the victory of all the people Victor had mistreated. Today, the cleaning lady had shown the world that even the smallest voice could make the biggest difference. As the days went on, things at Pinnacle Enterprises began to change. The workers, once invisible, were seen and heard. Raises were given to the cleaning crew, better hours were implemented, and the culture of greed and exploitation that had defined Victor's leadership was dismantled. Clara was no longer just a janitor. She was a leader, and she would make sure that Pinnacle Enterprises would never be the same again. For years, Julia Morris had been silently seething with anger. As the office janitor, she had witnessed the worst of what her company, Starlight Enterprises, had to offer. The CEO, Richard Hawk, was a cruel, ruthless man who had made countless decisions that ruined lives. He saw his employees as nothing more than tools to increase his wealth and power. His public speeches were full of promises of success and growth, but behind closed doors, he treated everyone with disdain, especially the lowly workers like Julia. One particular incident stuck with Julia. Richard had humiliated her in front of the entire office when she had accidentally spilled coffee near his desk. His condescending words had stung, and in that moment, she made a vow: she would make him pay for every wrong, every injustice he had caused. Revenge became her fuel, and she spent years meticulously planning her retaliation. She began to observe the company closely. When no one was watching, she started collecting little pieces of evidence, documents left carelessly on desks, emails that Richard had mistakenly sent to the wrong people, and whispers from colleagues about shady financial practices. She even gathered accounts from employees who had been unfairly fired or treated poorly by Richard. Each piece of information brought her closer to her goal. Her plan was simple: expose Richard for the corrupt leader he truly was. Armed with damning evidence, she would bring him down, and perhaps, in the process, take control of Starlight Enterprises for herself. She imagined the moment of his downfall vividly, his face twisted in shock and disbelief, his empire crumbling around him. Every day she spent cleaning the office, she imagined the sweet taste of revenge. The day of the annual shareholder meeting arrived. Julia's heart pounded as she silently cleaned the lobby, watching the executives and board members arrive. She could feel the tension in the air. Today was the day. Today, Richard would finally pay. She had planted everything in motion. She had sent an anonymous email to key members of the board, containing the evidence of Richard's unethical practices and financial corruption. They were ready to confront him, to strip him of his power. Julia knew that the downfall of a man like Richard would take careful execution, and she had rehearsed every step of the plan in her head. The meeting began, and Julia, as usual, was there, quietly cleaning the floors, just another invisible presence in the room. But she wasn't just cleaning today, she was waiting, watching. Soon, a tense silence filled the room as the board members began to confront Richard with the evidence. The look on his face shifted from smug confidence to confusion, then panic. He stammered, attempting to explain himself, but his lies quickly unraveled as the board members presented the undeniable proof. For a moment, Julia allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of seeing him squirm, his control slipping away. But something was off. She had expected him to beg for forgiveness, to try to fight back with anger or threats. But Richard remained eerily calm. He didn't lash out, didn't try to manipulate the situation. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Do you really think this will work?" Richard's voice was steady, almost mocking. "You think I'm the only one who's been playing this game?" Suddenly, Julia's heart sank. It was all going wrong. Richard had anticipated this. He had prepared for it. The board members, once so eager to turn against him, were now hesitating. Some were even backing away, unsure whether to proceed with the accusations. Richard had outmaneuvered them. He had spent years building relationships with the key decision-makers, using his charm, his wealth, and his influence to ensure loyalty. Julia watched in disbelief as Richard began to turn the tables. He twisted the narrative, framing her as a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta, suggesting that the evidence she had gathered was falsified. Some board members, already loyal to him, took his side, casting doubt on the validity of the information. The failed revenge weighed heavily on Julia's chest. She had thought that exposing Richard would be enough to bring him to justice, but she hadn't accounted for his cunning, for the power of his influence over the people who could have stopped him. She had underestimated him, and herself. In the end, it wasn't Richard who paid the price for his actions, it was Julia. She was quickly dismissed from the company, and the board members, unwilling to challenge Richard's authority, allowed him to continue as CEO. The files she had sent out were ignored, and her plan to take control of Starlight Enterprises crumbled to dust. As she packed her belongings and left the building for the last time, Julia realized that revenge, no matter how carefully plotted, doesn't always lead to the results you expect. The power of influence, of relationships, and of wealth had won out. She had failed. But as she stood outside Starlight Enterprises, her mind started to shift. Maybe revenge wasn't the answer. Maybe she had been so consumed by the idea of bringing Richard down that she had forgotten what truly mattered, her own sense of integrity, her own worth. As the days passed, she realized that while she might not have won this battle, she had learned something invaluable. She had learned that true change comes not from seeking revenge but from transforming oneself, from making a difference in the world in ways that are more meaningful than any act of retaliation. She didn't need to be the CEO to make an impact. Julia left Starlight Enterprises behind, but she carried with her the lessons learned, a new sense of purpose, and the understanding that sometimes, the best revenge is simply moving on, leaving the toxicity behind, and choosing to build something better for herself. The journey was just beginning, and she knew it was time for a positive change. For years, Olivia Clark had quietly and silently observed the corrupt operations of Renaissance Tech. The janitor's uniform she wore every day concealed more than just her job title, it hid her immense knowledge and power. Every morning, she walked through the gleaming halls of the corporate headquarters, pushing her cleaning cart as though she was just another invisible cog in the system. To the company's executives, she was little more than a piece of furniture in the background, something to be ignored and disregarded. But Olivia wasn't just any janitor. She had a secret. 15 years ago, her father, a close friend of the company's founder, had passed away and left her a significant portion of shares in Renaissance Tech. At the time, she hadn't fully grasped the weight of her inheritance, but as the years went by, she realized the magnitude of what she held. She was the majority shareholder, though no one, especially Gregory Shaw, the ruthless CEO, had any idea. And for those 15 years, Olivia had done nothing but clean the floors, never letting anyone see the fire that burned inside her. But she had been watching, quietly collecting evidence, and waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came after an incident that would change everything. It was a typical day in the lobby of Renaissance Tech. Olivia was doing her job, mopping the floor, when Gregory Shaw and his entourage swaggered through. They were laughing loudly, obnoxiously, unaware of their surroundings. The CEO, with his usual arrogance, pointed at a spill near the elevator and sneered, "Clean it up, lady. You're not paid to stand around." His voice rang out with the cruel arrogance that he carried with him every day. Olivia's heart pounded, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. The laughter of his colleagues echoed in the background. She wanted to scream, to throw down her mop and walk out, but instead, she held her tongue. This wasn't the time. This time, she would get her revenge, but it would be on her terms. That night, after a long day of cleaning, Olivia sat alone in her small apartment. Her mind was racing. She couldn't let Gregory get away with this anymore. She couldn't let him humiliate her or anyone else. She picked up the phone and called Daniel, an old friend from law school. The two of them met at a small diner a few miles from the office, far from prying eyes. There, Olivia laid everything out. She told Daniel about Gregory's illegal activities, his corrupt business practices, the way he had laid off loyal employees just to line his own pockets. Daniel's eyes lit up as Olivia spoke. "You have the power to end this, Olivia," he said. "You're the majority shareholder. You can destroy him." Olivia's pulse quickened as Daniel explained how she could leverage her shares to expose Gregory's wrongdoings. She had everything she needed to bring him down: documents, emails, financial records, proof of everything. As the weight of it all settled in, Olivia felt something new stir within her. She wasn't powerless anymore. She was ready. For the next few weeks, Olivia quietly gathered evidence, each piece of documentation more damning than the last. She had known about Gregory's shady dealings for years, but now she had the proof she needed. Every night after cleaning the office, she would slip into the copy room, printing out emails and reports that had been carelessly discarded. Each page felt like a victory, and as the evidence grew, so did Olivia's resolve. She no longer saw herself as the janitor. She was a woman with a mission, and nothing would stop her from achieving it. The day of reckoning finally arrived. The annual shareholders' meeting was just around the corner, and Olivia was ready to make her move. She walked into Renaissance Tech on that morning, the same as every other day. But this time, her mop and bucket weren't the only thing she carried. Inside her bag was the proof of Gregory's corruption, ready to be unleashed. She wore the same janitor's uniform, blending in with the background as usual, but her mind was sharp and focused. As Olivia walked toward the boardroom, she saw Gregory standing at the head of the table, laughing with the other executives. The smug expression on his face made her blood boil. He had no idea what was coming. She waited outside the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment felt surreal, as though time had slowed down. When Daniel's text came through, telling her it was time, she took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The room went silent as she stepped inside, the familiar sound of her mop bucket clinking against the floor. Gregory, never one to show respect for anyone beneath him, laughed when he saw her. "What's this? The cleaning lady crashing a business meeting?" His words were meant to belittle her, but Olivia stood tall, refusing to shrink back. "I'm not just the cleaning lady, Gregory," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I own this company." A silence fell over the room as the shock of her words rippled through the board members. Gregory's confident sneer faded as he processed what she had said. He laughed, trying to brush it off. "Nice joke, sweetheart. You're the janitor, go back to mopping." Olivia ignored him. She walked toward the table, her heart pounding with anticipation. Without missing a beat, she opened her folder and began reading from the documents she had gathered. Falsified reports. Illegal layoffs. emails where Gregory referred to employees as disposable. She read each piece of evidence aloud, her voice firm and unyielding. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them even looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze as the truth became undeniable. Gregory's face drained of color as Olivia continued to reveal his deceit. Finally, she pulled out her phone, showing a picture of the cleaning crew that Gregory had exploited for years. "These people deserve raises," she said, her voice strong. "And I'm giving it to them." The room was filled with stunned silence, followed by the sound of reluctant applause from a few board members. For the first time in her life, Olivia felt seen. The years of humiliation, of being invisible to the world, had ended in that single moment. Gregory, now red-faced and furious, tried to defend himself, but Olivia was done listening. She had already won. "You're fired, Gregory," she said simply. The boardroom erupted in whispers as Gregory stumbled over his words, trying to salvage his crumbling empire. But it was too late. Olivia had the power, and she wasn't backing down. As she left the meeting, Olivia's phone buzzed with news alerts. CEO ousted in shareholder coup. The world was watching as Gregory's empire collapsed. News stations picked up the story, and within hours, regulators had frozen Gregory's accounts, seized his assets, and launched an investigation into his corrupt practices. It was a public humiliation he could never recover from. The next day, Olivia walked through the Renaissance Tech offices, but this time, there was no uniform to hide her identity. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, and when people saw her, they didn't look at her with pity or dismissal. They looked at her with respect. The janitors, the assistants, and even the executives who had once ignored her, now saw her as a leader, a symbol of power and justice. Olivia had not just taken down a corrupt CEO, she had transformed the company. She started implementing changes that empowered the workers, made the workplace safer, and ensured that the employees who had been treated as disposable for so long finally received the respect they deserved. Gregory, meanwhile, was left in the dust, his reputation tarnished forever. He had tried to retaliate with a lawsuit, but Olivia's records were airtight. His case was thrown out, and his empire crumbled further. The once powerful CEO was now just a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. In the end, Olivia didn't just defeat Gregory. She became the change she had longed to see. Renaissance Tech became a place of fairness and respect, and Olivia's legacy was sealed. She had started as an invisible janitor, but now she was the CEO, and she would make sure that no one would ever be invisible again.